Friends, today we plan to discuss the aesthetic formalism, the 20th century modern theory, in our program on philosophy and aesthetics meant for the postgraduate course in visual arts. Aesthetic formalism, though is considered to be a modern theory, roots of which can be traced in so many earlier writings. Perhaps it can go back to Platonic period. Plato once has written that why can't we go beyond the bondages of content, bondages of subject matter, and try to create the pure beauty using cones and cubes and cylinders, which is almost a formalistic thought where he is trying to go beyond the content. Formalism is an attempt focus on the form rather than the content. They almost try to plead that content is irrelevant. The earlier theories, even the theory of Riti in Indian aesthetics, tries to say something similar. That they say that Ritiratma Kavyasya, the manner, the way a thing is expressed is more important than the content of it. To some extent, it is true. Vamana, Dandi, Bhamaha pleaded in a similar fashion. The formalists are also trying to say the same thing. That for example, the topic like mother and child has been portrayed by so many painters. Every major painter has painted mother and child, but there are a very few which we consider as masterpieces. Annunciation has been painted by every European painter, but Leonardo's Annunciation is considered to be a masterpiece. Love stories have been written by so many people, but Shakuntala and Romeo and Juliet are considered to be masterpieces. Where exactly do they stand different than the other works of art which express the same content? It is the form. So finally, what we appreciate, the thing which gives us the aesthetic experience, aesthetic pleasure, is the form, according to these formalists. The argument can be extended further that to appreciate Buddhist art, you don't have to be a Buddhist. To appreciate Ajanta, you don't have to be a student of Buddhism or scholar of Buddhism. Without knowing anything about Buddhism, you can appreciate Ajanta. Without knowing anything about Greek mythology, you can appreciate Greek art. The same is true about Chinese landscape. You don't have to know about Taoism or you don't have to know about Confucianism to appreciate Chinese painting. Which means that finally what we respond to is the form. And form is a universal language. Like when they talk about the different possibilities of aesthetic expression, the lingual expression, the literature comes at the bottom of this list because it is accessible only to those people who know that language. On the other hand, painting can be understood by most of the people who do not belong to that particular region, that particular culture, that particular civilization. And perhaps it can be said so even more vehemently about music. The formalists always considered instrumental music as the mean of universal communication. The language, you don't have to know the content, it is just a pure form. And that is the real aesthetic experience which a mankind can offer to another mankind. Now, again, they are talking about the form and the importance of form over the content. They are almost trying to say that content is almost irrelevant. There are so many scholars. There are several schools of formalism. There is the German school of formalism, and though scholars like Zimmermann are leading that school, Hanslick is a very important scholar who pleaded about the aesthetics of music. There is Russian scholar of formalism, but today we are keeping our discussion restricted only to British formalism, and the two most important scholars of British formalism, that is Roger Fry and Clive Bell. They almost plead the same thing, almost have a unanimous argument on this particular issue. Now, going back to the history or the historical developments before the introduction of formalism, we can see that Romanticism is gradually on the decline, and it is being more and more sentimental. It is getting more and more intricate, more and more cryptic, loaded with very intricate symbols and metaphors. At that juncture, a group of painters came up and they started focusing more on the actual appearance of the painting, and we know them as Impressionists. In Impressionist painting, the content is not very important. It is the end product that gives you the pleasure, and we know that painters like Monet have tried to give radically a different thought to painting. It becomes more crystallized in the next generation, in the post-impressionist generation, and the artists also start getting more and more vocal about their position. We know painters like Sura, we know painters like Caesar. Now Sura in his letters has talked about the formal elements in painting. He talks about the verticality, he talks about the horizontality, he talks about the color effects, he talks about the breaking of color spectrum. We also know painters like Caesar, who has tried to give a different interpretation of painting. Now he is not keeping himself restricted towards the representation of nature. Of course, he relies on the nature. He paints hillocks, he paints mountains, he paints rivers, he paints jungles, trees, still lifes in his painting. But at the same time, the statement which has given is very interesting. He says, I dream in front of nature. So he is not only trying to imitate what he is seeing, but he is trying to create another reality using the reality which he is seeing. The reality which has been given to him, he is trying to reinterpret that reality, and which is reduced to an object. The mountain doesn't remain a mountain in Caesar's painting. It becomes an object, it becomes an aesthetic object. So gradually these developments are taking place, and the history of formalism also come into being almost at the same time. The developments in the actual art practice and the theoretical developments are almost parallel to each other. Formalism normally is associated with the heroic spirit of modernism. We know that modernism believes in rationale, modernism believes in logic, and similarly formalism also tries to plead the same values. Rather, when it comes to values, formalists are trying to dissociate the values which we respect as values, the moral values, the social values, the cultural values, even the economic values. All these values are dissociated from painting by the formalist. They believe that these values are instrumental values. They are not intrinsic values, because they are not the values which make a painting a better painting. These values are the values which are to be followed in everyday life, not in art. The art should be free of these values. The art is beyond all these values, and art has its own intrinsic values which make a work of art more relevant. So they are keeping aside the values, they are keeping aside the content. While talking about poem, there is a beautiful statement, of course a debatable statement, that while talking about poem, they say a poem has to be. It need not mean anything. A poem need not mean anything, it has to be. The very existence of the poem is the beauty of it, not the meaning of it. Of course, we keep wondering that this kind of poem, which does not have a meaning, whether can it be a part of literature? Because literature totally free of meaning is beyond our imagination. Of course, in Dadaistic poetry, we do come across some experimentation where the poems do not have meaning. But that poetry is not the formal experiment. That is again a very different attempt towards understanding art. Let's not bring those poems in this discussion. But here, the activity which is free of meaning, which is free of values, which is having its own order. Because somewhere the formalists are trying to plead that the world that has been given to us is sans any order. It doesn't have an order. There is a chaos in it. The world is full of chaos, and it is the art discovers order in it. So in a way, art is a corrective of nature. The actual life is chaotic. The aesthetic life is orderly. So art is a corrective of nature. The nature is not perfect. The nature is chaotic. We give order to the nature. This is a very interesting way of looking at it. Now, to explain this, they have used a very interesting phenomenon. So when it comes to everyday life, the everyday life is conventional, the everyday life is monotonous, but at the same time, the everyday life is familiar. We feel safe in the everyday life because it is familiar to us. This familiarity itself prevents us from getting the aesthetic experience from the everyday life. The life that we live in fails to give us an aesthetic experience, an exalted experience, because it is too familiar with us. When you see a person walking on the street, it cannot give you any pleasure. But when you see a person dancing, that gives you pleasure. what exactly is the difference between the dance and walking? This is defamiliarizing. Now, walking is also a movement on feet. Dancing is also a movement on feet. The dancer discovered the familiar part of your activity, your movement, and eliminated that familiar part, which gave rise to an activity which gave you the aesthetic experience. So dancing is derived from walking, but by defamiliarizing the walking, we created dancing. This precisely is the aesthetic process. In aesthetic process, we will have to defamiliarize things. The familiar life, the everyday life, the conventional life which is known to us, which offers us a set of experiences of which we are really tired, and to go away from those experiences and offer an exalted experience to the onlooker is the purpose of art according to the formalism. This exalted experience is a very curious term. They say that art is an experience which the everyday life can never offer you. Now, something similar has been said by the Romantist also. The Romantist, Abercrombie, says that it offers you the experience of the light which was never seen on the sea. So something unusual, something exalted, something exciting, something sublime was the definition of art even in the Romantic period. The formalists are not trying to talk about it. They are trying to say that it is not the sublime part which they are talking about. It is the same experience which is being offered to you, but it is reorganized in such a manner that it gets totally exalted from the everyday experience. So it is an exalted experience, it is an extraordinary experience, it is an exciting experience which gives you a very peculiar feeling. That peculiar feeling, only a particular form, only a significant form has a capacity to give that peculiar feeling to the spectator. So what the formalists are trying to tell us is art is not representation of reality. It is a reality in itself, and that is why it is also artificial. It is an experience which the everyday life cannot offer you. This experience, which is disinterested, which is exalted, it is an unnatural experience, it is an artificial experience, which is a product of imagination. This reminds me of Bharata's statement where he says, Natyam bhavanu kirtanam. Natya is not an anukarana, it is not an imitation of reality, it is a recreation of reality. A significant form may have references to reality. It is quite possible that it is, they are not trying to say that every aesthetic expression is totally delinked from nature. That's not true. The representation of nature will be there, but it will not be a representation, it will be only an inspiration, like we see it in Caesar, like we see it in Sura. So this particular experience, which is different than the descriptive arts, like if we go back to the descriptive arts, even a descriptive art has a capacity to give you an exalted experience, a very uncommon experience, like a work of art like War and Peace or a work of art like Mahabharata may offer that kind of experience to you, but the formalists say that the works which are representational, which are religious, which are narrative, these works will point at that exalted experience. They will hint at that exalted experience. They will lead you to that exalted experience. But a pure formal experience is an incarnate experience itself. There is a difference between the two. Causing the experience, leading you to the experience, it is like a description of a beautiful sight and the beautiful sight itself. A good description of a beautiful sight will also give you the aesthetic pleasure, but it will only hint at the pleasure. When you see the sight yourself, it is the experience incarnate. The formal experience is an incarnate experience. It doesn't hint at the experience, it offers the experience to you. This is the basic difference between the art with meanings, the art which are representational art based on contents, and the formal expression. This is what they are trying to plead. Now, when we say that it is unnatural, it is uncultural, we were talking about the defamiliarization. We referred to the act of dancing, and we saw the act of dancing is defamiliarizing the walking, which means that it is an artificial experience which is based on imagination. The art is a product of imagination. Now, when it comes to imagination, the formalists have a very interesting argument to offer to you. They say that every human being lives on two levels. Like we lead a practical life and we lead an imaginary life. Every person, at every act, because since we live in this world and since we have to deal with the practical of the world around us, our everyday life is a practical life. You have to take into consideration so many things which normally you do not really want to. There are several examples that have been given by the formalist. It may not be possible for us to discuss all of them, but they say that even the judgment on practical level it would be different, on imaginative level it would be different. Imaginative level is instinctual level. If I try to give an example, that if I need to choose a person for a particular job, I will take into consideration so many other things which are not related to his ability to do that job. A person who is best equipped to do that job may not be a very congenial person by nature. So obviously, though he is a more competent person, I may not select him. I would prefer the other person who is more congenial, who is more manageable, who is more loyal to me, who is more cooperative to me. So actually, I chose an inferior person for the sake of the practical requirements. Now, here my actual judgment, my imaginative judgment, my instinctive judgment and my practical judgment differed, because the practical judgment is always governed by so many interests. So all the practical things are interested things. There are several personal interests, there are social interests, there are collective interests which keep governing the practical life of mankind. But that is not so in case of imaginative. If somebody asks me that which is a better candidate for that post, I would, without any hesitation, would say that candidate A is certainly better, but he can create many problems if he is selected. So B was selected for that. Now, this is true about everything. My judgment is a very interesting illustration that has been given by Roger Freud. Now, our experiences, we think that the first-hand experience is the best experience. Normally, we consider, even in philosophy, Pratyaksha Praman is considered to be the best Praman. If I undergo that experience, obviously, nobody else can have that experience better than me. But is that really true? The formalists give an example of a charging bull. If you are walking through a narrow lane and if a bull comes charging to you, do you really think that at that juncture you will wait and try to allow that experience to grow on you? Would you even bother to look at that bull? The first thing an individual would do is to search for some shelter. Leaving behind the footwear, perhaps you will run to the shelter and save yourself. Now, you have not seen that bull carefully. You have not seen how he came charging towards you. You sought shelter, you saved yourself, and when you narrated that story to your friend, at that juncture, you supplemented that fragmented experience. Actually, your experience was a very fragmented experience. You entered into that lane, you saw something huge charging towards you. At the most, you recognize that it is a bull and he can be dangerous. So, that is the only piece of experience that you are actually carrying home. But when you narrated that story, you told that person that when you saw the bull, how he looked like, what was his color, how the eyes were, how the tail was held up, and then how he came charging to you, how you felt. Then you started trembling, you didn't know what to do. You will narrate the whole story with all the details and will make it into a complete experience. Now, this complete experience is not the real experience. The real experience is fragmented. The complete experience is properly well-knit, coherent experience, which means that your imaginary life is more coherent than your actual life. He gives another example of a suspicious lover. The lover sees his girlfriend with another boy, and now the emotional turmoil that he undergoes, and finally he comes to know that the person girlfriend was seen at movie hall was her cousin. And now, so the judgments which he tried to draw, they were governed by his emotions. They were governed by his personal sentiments. So every practical decision, every practical judgment, every practical experience that we have is always fragmented and incomplete. Your imagination makes it complete. It is true about art also. If you try to imitate the world as it is, it will be an incomplete, chaotic expression. When you supplement it with your imagination, when you try to make it into a complete expression by supplementing it with your imagination, which is not your actual experience of the world, then it will be a complete work of art. A work of art, it is not a representation of reality, it is a corrective of reality. It is a recreation of reality. Formalism and that particular expression will give you a very different kind of pleasure to the connotation. So that particular experience, which is a complete experience, is called the significant form. This significant form gives a peculiar feeling to the spectator, and that is the aesthetic experience. The feeling which is offered by the significant form to the spectator is the aesthetic. The formalists plead for that kind of experience. Now, it gave rise to different kinds of expression. Art started becoming more and more pure, and abstract painting is a product of formalism. Other optical art, all this modernist experimentation in the beginning of 20th century is obviously the derivation of formalist theory. Formalism doesn't appear like a theory to us because we have accepted many of these things as a basic reality of any aesthetic expression. We know the significance of form in any aesthetic creation, though recently in postmodern times the form is losing its ground again. Now art has reached a different level. Now the formal qualities are no more important in the aesthetic expression. But in the beginning of 20th century, formalism played a very crucial role to establish a notion of autonomous art to the aesthetic world, and that is why, though it lived for a very short while, formalism is an important theory in the history of Western aesthetics.